The year is 1884. The scent of pine and damp earth hangs heavy in the air of Havenwood, a small, isolated town nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. The town is a bastion of tradition, its lifeblood a strict, unyielding adherence to the Word of God. Every Sunday, the pews of the old stone church are filled with families, their faces etched with the hardships of rural life and the quiet solemnity of their faith. The previous minister, a kind but frail old man, had passed away in the spring, leaving the town's spiritual heart empty. A few weeks later, a new man arrived. He came not from a seminary in a bustling city, but from a small, unknown parish far to the north. His name was Elias Thorne. He was a man of contrasts, his features sharp and severe, yet his eyes held a disquieting calm. He was tall, his frame lean and powerful beneath his simple black cassock. His voice, when he spoke from the pulpit, was a low, resonant baritone that commanded attention, filling the small church with an authority the town had never known. From the very beginning, Thorne's sermons were different. He preached not of fire and brimstone, but of a more intimate, personal relationship with God. He spoke of purification, of stripping away the sins of the flesh to achieve a true, unblemished spirit. The townspeople were initially wary, but his words were powerful, and soon a certain fascination took hold. He was a man of simple needs, living in the old parsonage on the edge of town, a solitary figure who spent his days tending a small vegetable garden and his evenings in quiet contemplation. The first hint of the strange came not from his sermons, but from his baptisms. Havenwood's baptisms were always a public affair, held in the cold, clear waters of the nearby creek. But Thorne changed the custom. He declared that for a true spiritual cleansing, the baptism must be private, a sacred ritual between the individual and God. He announced that he would conduct the baptisms one by one, and that the townspeople should not attend. He insisted that the true path to salvation was through individual sacrifice and solitude. The new approach raised some eyebrows, but no one dared question the man of God. He was, after all, a spiritual leader, and his sermons were so compelling, so full of conviction. The first to be baptized under the new method was Sarah Jenkins, a quiet young woman known for her piety. She emerged from the private ceremony with a radiant, almost otherworldly glow. "I feel reborn," she told her mother, her voice a hushed whisper. Pastor Thorne showed me a true path to purity. More women followed, drawn by Sarah's newfound serenity. They were all young, unmarried women who had lived quiet lives. Each returned with the same radiant calm, their eyes reflecting a newfound peace. But as time went on, a subtle shift occurred. The women who had been baptized began to spend more time alone, their once sociable natures replaced by a withdrawn, almost secretive demeanor. They would attend church, their faces serene, but they would avoid eye contact and conversation, their piety taking on a rigid, unapproachable quality. The change was most noticeable in Sarah Jenkins. She was no longer the cheerful girl who helped her mother with the chores. She was distant, her laughter gone, her conversations brief and to the point. When her mother, Eleanor, asked her about the baptism, Sarah would simply say, "It was a sacred moment, Mother. A cleansing of the soul." The words were an echo of what Thorne himself had said. It was as if he had implanted a script in their minds. A few months passed. The whispers in town began to grow louder. Why did Pastor Thorne insist on baptizing the women alone, and why did they return so changed? The men of Havenwood, burdened by their own work and the belief that the church's affairs were not their business, dismissed the concerns. "It's a new way," they would say. "The pastor knows what's best for their souls." But for Eleanor Jenkins, the silence was deafening. Her daughter, her sweet Sarah, was a stranger in her own home. She saw the light in her daughter's eyes dimming, replaced by an unsettling placidity. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, she went to the parsonage. The door was ajar, and as she approached, she heard Thorne's voice, a low murmur from within. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw a flickering light from the window, and curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed, won out over her fear. She tiptoed to the window and peered inside. The room was illuminated by a single oil lamp. Thorne was kneeling, not in prayer, but hunched over a large, leather-bound book. His back was to her, but she could see his hands moving, his fingers tracing the lines of what looked like a journal. A cold dread, a feeling she had never known, washed over her. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. This is just the beginning of the story of Havenwood and Pastor Elias Thorne. If you're captivated by the mystery and want to know what happens next, be sure to subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss the secrets hidden within the parsonage. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the night. She retreated from the window, her mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. The sight of Thorne, hunched over that book with such intense focus, had been unsettling. It was not the posture of a man of God at prayer, but of a man consumed by something else entirely. The image clung to her, a parasitic dread that burrowed deep into her thoughts. She knew she shouldn't have seen what she saw, and the weight of that knowledge was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She returned home, the short walk feeling like a journey through a hostile landscape. Her husband Thomas was already asleep, his steady breaths a testament to the peace that she no longer felt. She lay awake for hours, the image of the parsonage, the flickering light, and the hunched figure replaying in her mind. What was in that book? What was the true nature of Thorne's baptisms? The questions gnawed at her, and with each passing hour, the placid, distant look in her daughter's eyes became a source of growing terror. The next morning she tried to speak to Thomas to share her concerns. "He's not a true man of God, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong with him." Thomas, however, dismissed her fears with a wave of his hand. "Eleanor, you're just worried about Sarah. The man is a pastor. He's doing God's work. The women are just finding a deeper faith, that's all." His words were a cold comfort, a reflection of the town's blind trust in the new minister. She realized then that she was alone in her suspicions. The town was under a spell of his making, a collective hypnosis born of fear and piety. Eleanor's only ally was Martha, the town's midwife and her oldest friend. Martha was a pragmatic, no-nonsense woman who had seen the full spectrum of human nature. She had noticed the change in the young women as well, a subtle but undeniable hollowness behind their calm facades. "It's not right, Eleanor," Martha said one afternoon as they sat on her porch, their voices low and conspiratorial. "They're like dolls, empty inside. It's as if he's taking something from them." Martha's words, though speculative, validated Eleanor's fears. Together, they hatched a plan. They knew that on Tuesday evenings, Pastor Thorne went to the neighboring town of Harmony to visit a bedridden parishioner. It was their only window of opportunity. The risk was immense. If they were caught, their reputations would be destroyed. They would be branded as heretics, their families ostracized. But the thought of Sarah, lost to this strange, silent faith, outweighed their fear. Tuesday arrived, a day that felt heavy with foreboding. The air was thick with humidity, a storm gathering on the horizon. As dusk settled, Eleanor and Martha, cloaked in dark shawls, made their way to the parsonage. The small wooden house was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the lively homes they had just left. The lock on the back door was old and rusted, and with a careful push, it gave way with a soft groan. They slipped inside, the air of the parsonage thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The single lamp on the main table was their only source of light. They found the large, leather-bound journal exactly where Eleanor had seen it, on a small wooden desk in the corner. As Martha stood watch, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm, Eleanor opened the book. The pages were filled with Thorne's precise, elegant handwriting. It was not a religious text, nor a personal diary. It was a meticulous, chilling record. The entries were dated, each one corresponding to the day a woman was baptized. There were no names, only initials. Beneath each set of initials was a detailed clinical description of the woman's spiritual state before and after the cleansing. But it was the language that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Thorne spoke not of souls, but of vessels. He described his process as a purging of emotional contaminants, a refinement of the spirit. He noted how the women's emotional residue was transferred during the private ceremony. He wrote about the purity of a vacant vessel and the burden of human sentiment. A cold, sickening realization dawned on Eleanor. The baptisms were not about purification, they were about emotional and psychological stripping. He wasn't cleansing their souls, he was emptying them. He was taking their joy, their love, their sorrows and their fears, leaving them as blank slates, vessels devoid of all human feeling. The journal was a log of his horrifying experiment, a record of every young woman he had emotionally and psychologically drained. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Eleanor slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. "Martha, we have to go," she whispered, her voice a strangled gasp. "Now." They fled the parsonage, leaving the journal where they found it, the truth it contained a phantom weight in their minds. The storm broke as they reached their homes, the rain a torrential downpour washing the earth, but doing nothing to cleanse the newfound horror from their hearts. They had a terrible truth, a truth that could not be shared. No one would believe them, and they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they were now in grave danger. The days following their discovery were a blur of fear and paranoia for Eleanor and Martha. The secret they now held was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that made every breath a struggle. The town, oblivious to the darkness lurking in its spiritual center, continued its quiet, monotonous rhythm. The women who had been baptized continued their eerie, placid existence, and Pastor Thorne continued his sermons, his voice as smooth and commanding as ever. But now, when Eleanor and Martha heard him speak of purification and unburdened spirits, the words were not a source of comfort, but a sinister echo of the journal's chilling content. Eleanor tried to talk to her husband again, but Thomas was too consumed by his daily life and the community's trust in Thorne. "Eleanor, you've been acting strange since you went to Martha's," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Pastor Thorne is a good man. You need to pray on this. Your mind is troubled." His inability to see the truth was a frustrating, painful barrier. She couldn't tell him what she had seen. The journal's contents were so far beyond the realm of their shared reality that she feared he would think she was losing her mind. Their plan changed. They could not expose Thorne alone. They needed an ally, someone who would listen and believe them. Their thoughts turned to William, a young, skeptical journalist who had recently arrived in Havenwood, writing a series of articles on small-town life. He was an outsider, not yet tainted by the town's collective belief, and his profession was rooted in the pursuit of truth. They waited for a Sunday after the service, a day when the town was full of people, but the chance of a private conversation was high. They found William sitting on a bench outside the church, sketching the old stone building in his notebook. His face was a study in concentration. Martha approached him first, her voice low and urgent. "Mr. William," she said, "we need to speak with you, privately." William looked up, his eyes curious. He saw the genuine fear in their faces and agreed to meet them later that evening at a quiet spot by the creek. The location was far enough from town that their conversation could not be overheard. The air was cool and crisp as they met under the veil of twilight. The sound of the flowing water was a low, steady murmur. Eleanor and Martha took turns explaining their story, their voices hushed, their words a torrent of fear and desperation. They told him about the changed women, about Thorne's strange private baptisms, and finally about the journal and its chilling contents. They recounted the phrases, the vessels, the emotional residue, the purging of sentiment. William listened with an intensity that gave them hope. He was quiet for a long moment after they finished, his eyes distant, processing their words. He wasn't skeptical, not in the way they had feared. He was a journalist, trained to look for patterns and inconsistencies. "So, he is not taking their souls," William said, his voice a thoughtful whisper. "He is taking their emotions, their memories, their feelings, leaving them empty." The way he phrased it was chillingly precise. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "He's draining them. He's a monster, William, and no one in this town will believe us." William nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said, and the words were a lifeline. "I've noticed something strange too. I've been trying to interview the women for my articles, but they are all the same. They speak in a monotone. They smile with their lips, but not their eyes. I thought it was just the rural temperament, but now it makes a terrible kind of sense. They had found their ally, but they couldn't simply go to the authorities with their story. Without proof, it was just the wild accusation of two women against a respected man of God. The journal was the key. They needed to get it out of the parsonage, to secure it as evidence. The plan was to go back to the parsonage on the next Tuesday, when Thorne was away. This time William would come with them. The conspiracy was in motion. Eleanor, Martha, and William, a small island of truth in a sea of ignorance and blind faith, were now united against the man who was slowly, methodically, draining the life from the young women of Havenwood. The sense of dread was still there, a constant companion, but it was now tempered with a flicker of hope. They were no longer alone in their fight. But as they walked back to their homes, the knowledge that Thorne was a cunning, calculating predator and that he was capable of a monstrous act made them all look over their shoulders. They had to be careful. One wrong move could lead to a far more sinister end than anyone could imagine. The second Tuesday arrived, bringing with it a sense of high-stakes anticipation. The sky was a clear, cold blue, a stark contrast to the storm that had accompanied their first, terrifying visit to the parsonage. The three conspirators, Eleanor, Martha, and William, met at the edge of town as dusk began to settle, their faces a mixture of grim determination and palpable fear. Their plan was simple, and yet fraught with peril. Enter the parsonage, retrieve the journal, and bring it to the county sheriff in the next town over, far from Thorne's influence. As they approached the parsonage, a new detail presented itself. The windows were not just dark, they were boarded up on the side facing the town. It was a recent addition, a small, unsettling sign of Thorne's growing paranoia, or perhaps a defense against prying eyes. They crept around to the back, where the old rusty lock still held the door in place. This time William came prepared. He pulled a small, sturdy wire from his pocket, a tool he had learned to use from a brief stint as a locksmith's apprentice. With a series of delicate, precise movements, he worked the wire into the lock. After a few tense moments, a soft click echoed in the silence. They slipped inside, a wave of cold air and the same musty scent of old paper washing over them. William held a lantern, its single beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The house was cold and still, a silent tomb. Eleanor's heart hammered a rhythm of fear against her ribs. She led them to the small study where the journal had been, but the desk was empty. A collective gasp escaped them. The journal was gone. Their faces fell, a mix of disbelief and crushing defeat. Thorne had moved it. He must have sensed their intrusion, or perhaps he simply grew more cautious. A cold wave of despair washed over Eleanor. Their one piece of evidence, their only hope, was gone. "He knows," Martha whispered, her voice a tremor of fear. "He knows we were here." William, however, did not give up. He was a journalist, a man who saw stories not just in what was presented, but in what was hidden. "We need to look for a hiding place," he said, his voice low but firm. "Think like him. Where would he put something this important? Something he needs to keep safe, but also accessible." They began to search the small room, their movements frantic, their hope a dying ember. They checked under the desk, in the drawers, behind the books on the small bookshelf. Nothing. The room was sparse, a simple study with a desk, a chair, and the bookshelf. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, searching for an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit. Her gaze fell on the small, ornate crucifix hanging on the wall. It was the only decorative item in the room, and it seemed out of place in the sterile, functional space. She walked over to it, her hand shaking as she reached out and touched the wooden frame. It was loose. She gave it a gentle push, and to her surprise, it swung outward on a small hidden hinge, revealing a shallow indentation in the wall behind it. And there, nestled in the small space, was the journal. Her breath caught in her throat. He had hidden it in plain sight, a psychological trick for a man who used spiritual symbols to cloak his dark work. William carefully took the journal, his hands steady, a grim look of triumph on his face. "We have it," he whispered. "We have our proof." But as he lifted the journal, a small, loose piece of paper, folded into a tight square, fell from between its pages and fluttered to the floor. William bent down to pick it up. He unfolded it and held it up to the lamplight. It was a handwritten letter, the handwriting a feminine, elegant script. It was a list of names. And at the top of the list, in Thorne's precise handwriting, was a new, chilling entry. "Future vessels." The list was long, far too long, and contained the names of the unmarried young women who had not yet been baptized. And at the very top of that list was the name, Martha's daughter, Anne. A collective gasp of horror filled the room. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended anything she had ever felt. Her daughter, Anne, a vibrant, kind-hearted girl of 18, was on his list. She was his next target. The revelation was a cold, hard blow. The conspiracy was no longer just about exposing a monster. It was about saving her child. The discovery galvanized them. They could not wait. They had to act. They had to get the journal and the list to the authorities immediately. The night had suddenly grown much colder, and the air of the parsonage, once just musty, now felt heavy with a tangible evil. As they slipped out into the night, the wind howled around the house, a mournful, haunting sound that seemed to wail a warning. Thorne was more dangerous than they had ever imagined, and they had just entered his dark game. The discovery of Anne's name on Thorne's list of future vessels transformed the mission from a quest for justice into a desperate race against time. The abstract horror of the journal had now become terrifyingly personal, a cold, hard truth that struck at the very core of Martha's being. Her fear for her daughter was a fierce, burning flame, a primal instinct that fueled her every move and banished all traces of fatigue. The three of them, Eleanor, Martha, and William, fled the parsonage under the cover of the inky night, the stolen journal and the chilling list of names clutched tightly in William's hands. They knew they couldn't return to their homes. Havenwood was too small, too isolated, a town where whispers traveled faster than a man on horseback. To go back would be to walk into a trap. Their only hope lay in escaping to the county seat, a full day's journey away, where the sheriff had no ties to Pastor Thorne and could be trusted to act on the evidence. The road out of Havenwood was a long, winding path through a dense, suffocating forest, a journey that felt impossibly vast in the dead of night. The only horse they had access to was Eleanor's, a sturdy but slow mare that was more suited for pulling a plow than for a desperate flight. The cold night air bit at their faces as they rode, the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves a frantic, desperate beat in the oppressive silence. William held the reins, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his jaw set in a grim line. Eleanor and Martha sat behind him, huddled together for warmth and comfort, their minds a whirlwind of fear and grim determination. The weight of their secret, once a burden, was now a source of strength. They had to get to the sheriff. They had to expose Thorne. They had to save Anne. The fate of an innocent girl, a symbol of all the young women in the town, rested on their bruised and battered shoulders. As they rode on, the first hint of trouble came not as a sound, but as a chilling silhouette against the moonlight. A lone rider, a dark, hunched figure, appeared on the path behind them. He was a good distance away, but his pace was fast, his form a menacing presence in the darkness. A cold dread, a familiar feeling now, washed over Eleanor. It was Thorne. He was not a man to leave things to chance. He must have returned to the parsonage earlier than expected and discovered the missing journal, a discovery that would have unleashed the monster that lurked beneath his placid exterior. "He's following us," Martha whispered, her voice a thin, panicked thread that was barely audible over the sound of the horse's hooves. William's grip on the reins tightened, his knuckles turning white. "I know," he said, his voice grim and resolute. "Eleanor, how much farther to the main road?" "Too far," she said, her eyes fixed on the pursuing figure, now a little closer, a little more menacing. "He'll catch us." William, a journalist by trade but a man of action by necessity, made a swift, split-second decision. "There's a shortcut through the old logging trail," he said. "It's rough, but it might buy us some time." He steered the horse off the main path and into the dark, overgrown trail. The horse stumbled and struggled, the path a chaotic mess of gnarled roots and broken branches. The air grew colder, the trees a suffocating presence on either side, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab them. The sounds of the chase were muffled by the dense forest, but they could still hear the distant thud of hooves on the main road. Thorne was not far behind. He was a hunter, and they were his prey. The thought was a sickening, terrifying realization. They were not just a threat to his reputation. They were a threat to his very existence, and he would stop at nothing to silence them, to reclaim his chilling secrets. Suddenly the horse shied violently, whinnying in terror. A branch, thicker than a man's arm, had fallen across the path, a deliberate obstacle placed there to stop them. William pulled hard on the reins, but it was too late. The horse tripped and fell, sending the three of them tumbling into the cold, damp earth. The journal flew from William's hands, landing with a soft thud a few feet away, its pages spilling open in the dim moonlight. They scrambled to their feet, bruised and shaken, their bodies aching from the fall. The horse was on its side, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle. It was useless. They were stranded. The sound of Thorne's horse was growing closer now, a steady, rhythmic approach that was no longer a distant threat, but a terrifying reality. They had a few precious moments before he arrived. "The journal!" Martha yelled, pointing to the dark shape on the ground. William lunged for it, his hands closing around the leather-bound book, his one and only piece of evidence. Eleanor and Martha stood guard, their bodies tense, their eyes scanning the dark forest, their fear a palpable presence in the night. They had to run. But where? The forest was a maze of unfamiliar trails, and they were disoriented, their minds racing with panic. Just as the sound of Thorne's horse entered the logging trail, a new sound cut through the silence, a loud, sharp crack of a shotgun. The sound echoed through the forest, a terrifying punctuation to the frantic chaos. The horse behind them whinnied, a sound of pain and surprise, and then a heavy thud as it collapsed to the ground. A figure emerged from the shadows, a hunter with a long rifle in his hands. It was Old Man Davies, a recluse who lived deep in the woods, a man known for his keen eyesight and his fierce independence. He was a man of the land, not of the church, and he had no love for the new minister. He had seen them ride into the trail and had followed, his hunter's instincts sensing a prey and predator dynamic. "He was aiming for the horse," Old Man Davies said, his voice a low growl, his eyes fixed on Thorn's downed horse, now thrashing on the ground in agony. "He didn't want you to get away." Thorn himself was nowhere to be seen. He must have been thrown from the horse, his momentum sending him tumbling into the dark woods. The trio had a choice. They could wait for Thorn to recover and confront them, or they could leave him behind. The choice was a matter of life and death. The decision was swift. "He'll be back," William said, his voice a tremor of fear and adrenaline. "We have to go." They left Thorn and the downed horse behind, a small dark tableau in the middle of the logging trail. Old Man Davies, a silent, grim guardian, led them through the treacherous forest, his knowledge of the land a beacon in the darkness. They were still not safe, not yet. Thorn was a desperate, cunning man, and he was not the type to give up. The chase was not over. It had just begun. And they knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone that the next encounter, the final confrontation, would be far more deadly. The journey through the woods with Old Man Davies was long and treacherous, a silent procession under the cold, watchful eye of the moon. They walked for hours, their bodies bruised and aching, their minds consumed by the grim reality of their situation. Thorn was not just a pastor with a dark secret. He was a murderer in the making, and they held the only proof that could stop him. The sun was a sliver of gold on the horizon when they finally emerged onto the main road, battered and exhausted, but safe. Old Man Davies, a silent benefactor, left them at the edge of the woods, his face a grim mask of resolve. He had done his part. The rest was up to them. They continued their frantic journey on foot, their minds consumed by the grim reality of their situation. Thorn was a murderer in the making, and they held the only proof. The sun was a sliver of gold on the horizon when they finally reached the county seat, a small, bustling town that felt like a different world from the quiet, isolated gloom of Havenwood. They went directly to the sheriff's office, a small brick building with a faded sign that seemed to mock the chaos in their lives. The sheriff, a large, weary man named Sheriff Brody, listened to their story with a growing expression of disbelief. He was a man of the law, a man of fact. And their tale of a monstrous pastor, a secret journal, and emotionally drained women sounded like the ravings of three frightened, sleep-deprived people. He looked at them with a mixture of pity and skepticism, his eyes scanning their bruised faces and torn clothes. "Ladies, Mr. William," he said, his voice kind but firm. "I can't just arrest a man of God based on a story. The accusations are extraordinary." William, his face bruised and his clothes torn, slammed the journal and the list of names onto the sheriff's desk. "The proof is right here, Sheriff," he said, his voice ragged with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Read it. Read what he's been doing. Read the list of names, starting with Anne." Sheriff Brody, a professional man of the law, took a deep breath and opened the journal. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression shifting from skepticism to a grim, chilling understanding. He read the clinical descriptions of the vessels and the purging of emotional contaminants. He saw the meticulous notes, the precise, chilling language, the list of names, particularly Anne's, a young girl he remembered seeing at a town fair, was the final, gut-wrenching confirmation. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. His face, once a mask of skepticism, was now pale and horrified. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's not a pastor. He's a leech, a psychological vampire." The sheriff, a pragmatic man who understood the nature of his work, immediately assembled a small posse. He knew that if he went to Havenwood alone, the town's blind trust in Thorn would be a formidable obstacle. He needed a show of force, a visible sign that the law was coming. They would return to Havenwood at dawn, with the evidence and the authority to confront Thorn. But as the sheriff prepared his men, a new twist of fate arrived. A young, distraught man, his face a mask of fear, burst into the office. It was James, the son of the parishioner Thorne had supposedly been visiting. He had arrived in Havenwood to check on his mother and had learned a terrible secret. "The pastor, he never came to see my mother," James stammered, his body shaking. "He paid me to tell you that he was with her. He said it was for a private religious ritual. I thought he was a good man, but I just found a letter in his desk. He said he was going to expose a conspiracy against him." The letter, a short cryptic note, was a chilling final piece of the puzzle. It was a confession, but a confession cloaked in the language of a victim. He was trying to frame Eleanor and Martha, to make them look like vengeful liars. He was a master manipulator, a man who had planned every contingency, even his own downfall. The sheriff, with the journal and the letter in hand, was a man on a mission. The puzzle was complete. The motive was clear. Thorne wasn't just a monster. He was a brilliant, calculating one. The posse set off for Havenwood, the first rays of dawn painting the sky a fiery orange, a fitting color for the coming confrontation. Eleanor, Martha, and William were exhausted, but their hearts were filled with a grim satisfaction. The truth was finally coming out. But as they rode, a new wave of fear washed over them. Thorne was no longer a shadowy figure in a journal. He was a desperate man, a cornered animal, and a cornered animal was the most dangerous creature of all. He was still out there, in the town he had corrupted, and his next move would be one of pure, unadulterated desperation. The storm was about to break over Havenwood. The posse, a grim, silent procession of armed men, arrived in Havenwood as the morning mist still clung to the fields, their presence a stark and jarring intrusion in the quiet, pastoral town. The sheriff's horses, their hooves clattering on the main street, drew the attention of the few townsfolk already at work. The sight of Sheriff Brody and his men, accompanied by Eleanor, Martha, and William, sent a ripple of bewildered whispers through the community. The town, a place where everyone knew everyone, was suddenly filled with a cold, terrifying unfamiliarity. The posse dismounted in front of the old stone church, a silent, imposing structure that now seemed to loom over the town with an unsettling air. Sheriff Brody, his face a grim mask of resolve, led the way to the parsonage. The door was ajar, a silent invitation to the darkness within. They entered, their footsteps echoing in the empty, cold halls. The house was spotless, a perfect, unnerving kind of order that seemed to mock the chaos that lay beneath. There was no sign of Thorne. Sheriff Brody found a note on the small desk in the study, placed precisely where the journal had been. It was a single, elegant sentence written in Thorne's script. "The cleansing must be final." The cryptic message sent a shiver down their spines. What did it mean? A final cleansing of whom? It was a terrifying puzzle, and they had to solve it before it was too late. They split up, a frantic search for any sign of the pastor. The back garden, the barn, the woods nearby, nothing. The town, once so calm, was now a hive of activity, its peace shattered by the news of the search. The townsfolk, confused and disbelieving, gathered in small groups, their faces a mix of suspicion and denial. How could their beloved pastor be a monster? How could they have been so blind? As the search widened, a young boy, a tear-streaked look of fear on his face, ran up to Martha. "Mrs. Jenkins, my sister, she saw Pastor Thorne." The boy, whose sister had also been on Thorne's list, had seen him with his own eyes. "He was at the creek," the boy stammered, his voice a terrified whisper. "He was with Anne. He had a bag." A cold, sickening dread washed over Martha. The creek, the place where the baptisms took place, the final cleansing. It was a terrible, horrifying possibility. They rushed to the creek, the posse's horses thundering behind them. The banks of the creek were shrouded in a thick fog, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. They found them. Thorn was there, standing in the water, his back to them, holding Anne. Her face was a blank, terrifying mask, her eyes wide and vacant, her body limp in his arms. Thorn was holding her head under the water, a ritual of drowning. He was not trying to cleanse her. He was trying to kill her. He was trying to silence the last witness to his monstrous secret, to destroy the one living piece of evidence against him. Martha screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed through the quiet valley. The posse rushed forward, their shouts echoing through the fog. Thorn, a cornered animal, turned to face them. He was a man possessed, his eyes wild with a manic, desperate gleam. He let go of Anne, and she fell into the water, her body limp, her eyes still wide and vacant. William, an exhausted witness to this horror, didn't hesitate. He waded into the freezing water and pulled Anne's limp body to the shore. Martha, her hands trembling, knelt beside her daughter, her heart a frantic, panicked beat. Anne was unconscious, her body cold and still. Thorn, in a final, desperate act, pulled a knife from his robe. He lunged at Sheriff Brody, a final act of defiance. But the sheriff was a man of experience. He parried the blow and with a swift, brutal movement brought the butt of his rifle down on Thorn's head. The pastor crumpled to the ground, his body a lifeless, defeated heap. He was unconscious but alive. The battle was over, the monster was defeated. But the war was not won. The young women of Havenwood, the victims of his cruel, calculating experiment, were still emotionally vacant. Anne, still unconscious, was a testament to his final, most brutal act. They had the proof. They had the man. But they had a long, painful road ahead of them. The truth of the pastor's crimes would soon be known to the world, a dark and chilling tale that would forever change the town of Havenwood. But the most important question still remained. Could the damage he had done ever be undone? The news of Pastor Thorn's capture hit Havenwood like a biblical flood, washing away the carefully constructed facade of their peaceful, pious existence. The initial shock was a paralyzing silence, a collective gasp that hung in the air of the small town. People stood in their doorways, their faces pale and etched with disbelief. How could the man who had preached from their pulpit, who had blessed their children and buried their dead, be capable of such monstrosity? Their denial was fierce, a defense mechanism against a truth too painful to bear. But as Sheriff Brody's men recounted the chilling details of the journal and the attempted drowning of Anne, the denial crumbled, giving way to a raw, profound sense of betrayal. The old stone church, once a beacon of faith, now stood as a grim monument to their collective blindness, a silent witness to the horror that had festered in its shadow. The town's idyllic life was gone, replaced by a raw, open wound of grief, confusion, and a gnawing guilt. Sheriff Brody, a man of simple principles, had never felt a weight so heavy. He had seen his share of human depravity, but this was different. This was a violation of the soul. With the journal in hand, he presented the evidence to the town elders, his voice a low, somber drone as he read Thorn's clinical, chilling notes. The meticulous records of vessels, the cold descriptions of emotional residue, and the proof of Thorn's calculated cruelty. It was all there, undeniable and gut-wrenching. The truth was too terrible to be ignored, too meticulously documented to be dismissed as a fever dream. The elders, their faces ashen, could only stare at the pages, their faith in their community, in their own judgment, shattered. The immediate aftermath focused on Anne. Thanks to William's quick thinking and Martha's frantic efforts, she was saved from Thorn's final murderous act. She was alive, but her body was weak, and her mind was in a state of profound shock. For days, she remained in a deep, unresponsive sleep, her stillness a silent, fragile testament to the horrors she had endured. The other women, the vessels of Thorn's experiment, remained in their vacant, emotionless state. They were physically present, they ate and slept, and they moved through the town like living specters. But the light in their eyes, the spark of joy and sorrow, was gone, replaced by an unsettling, almost supernatural stillness. Havenwood had become a house of ghosts, its young women walking phantoms of their former selves, a constant, painful reminder of the evil that had taken root in their midst. The physical and psychological toll on Eleanor, Martha, and William was immense. They were hailed as heroes, but they felt anything but. They were bruised, battered, and emotionally exhausted, their courage born not of bravery but of desperation. Eleanor, in her restless dreams, still saw the hunched figure of Thorn in the flickering lamplight, his fingers tracing the pages of the journal, a haunting image that refused to be erased. Martha rarely left Anne's side, her face a constant mask of worry and pain, her heart a raw, open wound. William, the journalist, now had a story far more compelling than he had ever imagined. A dark and complex narrative of human depravity that he knew he had to tell. A story that would forever be etched into the history of this small Appalachian town. The psychological question that haunted them all was a silent, unanswerable prayer. Could the damage be reversed? Was the loss of emotion a permanent state? Was it something that could be undone? The town doctor, a kind but limited man, shook his head in bewildered helplessness. He had never seen anything like it. The women were physically healthy, but their minds were a locked box, a fortress of silence that no one could breach. There were no medicines, no treatments, no known path to recovery from a horror that was not of the body, but of the soul. The answer, they believed, lay with Thorn. He was the one who had done this, and he was the only one who could explain how. But Thorn, now a prisoner in a cold stone cell in the county jail, was a silent, unyielding enigma. He refused to speak to anyone. He sat in his cell, his hands cuffed, his face a mask of serene defiance, his eyes fixed on some distant internal world. He would not confess. He would not explain his methods. He was a wall of silence, a final, maddening obstacle that stood between the town and any hope of true healing. His silence was a final act of cruelty, a way of ensuring that his victims and the town he had corrupted would never find a way to truly move on. Frustrated by Thorn's impenetrable silence, William decided that if Thorn would not talk, he would write. He began to chronicle the story, his words a desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. He wrote about the town's blind trust, the gradual corruption, and the monstrous truth behind the pastor's baptisms. He hoped that by telling the story, he could bring some form of closure, some understanding to the senseless tragedy, a way of giving a voice to the victims who could not speak for themselves. His writing was a form of therapy, a way of channeling his own trauma into something that could help others. Eleanor, a woman who had once been filled with fear and desperation, now found a new, powerful purpose. She organized the families of the affected women, creating a support system built on the foundation of shared trauma and unwavering hope. They held vigils, they prayed, but most importantly, they talked. They shared their stories, their fears, their grief, and their small, fragile victories. They discovered that Thorn had isolated the women, separating them from their loved ones, making their cleansing a solitary internal process. They reasoned that if the isolation was part of the problem, then connection, love, and a community of support must be the antidote. They began to bring the women together, to surround them with the warmth and love that Thorn had tried to drain from them. The long and arduous process of healing had begun, but the road was long and the future was uncertain. The trial of Pastor Thorn was on the horizon, a final public reckoning. The town of Havenwood, once a forgotten speck on the map, was now the subject of a nationwide story, a chilling tale of a man who stole not money or goods, but the very essence of human feeling. The nightmare was not over. It was just entering a new, more painful phase, a phase that would test their faith, their resilience, and their ability to forgive. The trial of Elias Thorne was not just a local legal proceeding, it was a national sensation. The story of the pastor who baptized naked women was on every newspaper, its chilling details a source of morbid fascination and horrified debate. Journalists from all over the country, a motley crew of urban sophisticates, descended upon the quiet county seat, their notebooks and cameras a stark, jarring contrast to the somber, rural atmosphere. The courtroom, a small, dusty room in the county courthouse, was packed every day with a mix of curious onlookers and the grieving, defiant families from Havenwood. The prosecution's case was built on the unshakable foundation of the Journal. William, Eleanor, and Martha were the star witnesses, their testimonies weaving a horrifying tapestry of manipulation and abuse. They testified to the events, to the gradual chilling change in the women, to their desperate discovery of the Journal, and to the frantic, terrifying chase through the woods. The Journal itself, with its clinical chilling notes on vessels and emotional residue, was the centerpiece of the prosecution's argument. It was not just a diary. It was a manifesto of a cold, calculating man, a serial abuser who used the guise of religion to enact his heinous experiments, a predator who meticulously logged his prey. Sheriff Brody, a large man with a weary soul, testified about Thorne's capture, about finding him at the creek, about his final desperate act of violence. The other townsfolk, once so loyal to the pastor, now stood as witnesses to his manipulation. They told stories of how he had subtly turned them against their own neighbors, how he had preached a doctrine of isolation and personal piety that had, in hindsight, been a way to keep his victims from sharing their experiences. He had isolated them not just from their families, but from themselves, making them dependent on his twisted brand of spiritual guidance. But Thorne remained a silent, unyielding enigma. He sat at the defense table, his face a mask of serene defiance, his eyes fixed on some distant internal point. He never looked at the victims or their families. He never looked at his accusers. He was an unmovable object, a man who had chosen to be a blank slate, the very thing he had made his victims. His silence was a final act of control, a way of ensuring that even in his defeat, he would remain a mystery, a figure of terror and fascination. The defense, a young, eager lawyer from the city, tried to argue that the Journal was a religious text, a metaphorical document about spiritual cleansing. He tried to discredit the witnesses, to paint them as hysterical women and a scheming journalist, motivated by a desire for fame. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The physical presence of the vacant-eyed women in the courtroom, their silence a deafening testimony, was a powerful and undeniable counter-argument. You could argue away a journal, but you couldn't argue away a living, breathing ghost. The jury, a group of plain-faced men and women from the surrounding towns, listened with a profound sense of gravity. They had heard the evidence, they had seen the witnesses, and they had seen the victims. They had seen the true face of evil, not in a fire-breathing monster, but in a man who wore a pastor's collar. They retired to deliberate, their faces grim, the weight of their decision a visible burden. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unanimous. Guilty. Thorne was convicted of multiple counts of assault, psychological abuse, and attempted murder. The judge, a stoic man who had seen a lifetime of human cruelty, sentenced him to life in prison, a fate that seemed almost too lenient for the depths of his crimes. The courtroom erupted in a mix of sobs and sighs of relief. For the families of Havenwood, it was a moment of profound, painful closure. The monster was put away. He could no longer hurt anyone. But the scars he had left were still raw, a permanent reminder of the darkness that had touched their lives. The press left. The curious onlookers returned to their lives. Havenwood was left to pick up the pieces, to heal its wounds, and to find a way to live again. The old church was closed, its doors boarded up, a silent tomb. A new one would have to be built, not of stone, but of a renewed faith. A faith in community, in human connection, in a God that did not ask for the sacrifice of joy and emotion. The trial was over, but the long, difficult road of recovery was just beginning. The truth had come out. The villain was defeated. But the story was not over. The lingering question remained. Would the women ever recover? Would they ever be able to feel again? The long winter was settling over the Appalachians, a period of quiet, somber reflection. The town had survived the storm, but its landscape was forever changed. The final chapter, the one of hope and healing, was yet to be written. Years passed, a quiet succession of seasons that gradually softened the raw edges of Havenwood's trauma. The memory of Pastor Thorne, once a terrifying, all-consuming presence, slowly faded into a ghost story whispered around bonfires, a chilling tale of human darkness that served as a cautionary fable. The old stone church, a symbol of their collective blindness, was finally demolished. Its stones, once a source of unholy strength, were repurposed to build a small community center, a place of gathering and connection. A building that was born from the very materials of their suffering. A new, smaller church was built, its minister a kind, quiet man who preached a simple message of love, forgiveness, and the power of human connection. The healing process for the victims was a long and arduous one. For the women Thorne had victimized, the journey back to normalcy was a slow, agonizing crawl. They were not broken. They were empty. The task was not to fix them, but to fill them again, to reintroduce them to the world of human emotion. The families, led by Eleanor and Martha, created a new community, one built on the foundation of shared trauma and unwavering support. They encouraged the women to engage in activities that evoked emotion, music, art, poetry. They held weekly gatherings where the women would sit in a circle and listen to stories, to music, to the shared laughter and sorrow of their neighbors. It was a painstaking process, a form of emotional rehabilitation, a slow and deliberate effort to awaken the dormant parts of their souls. William, the journalist, published his book, The Havenwood Horror, a searing, critical expose on human manipulation and the fragility of faith. It was a commercial and critical success, and he used the proceeds to create a foundation for the victims of psychological abuse, a fund that helped the young women of Havenwood and others like them. He visited Havenwood often, a quiet, supportive presence, a man who had not just reported a story, but had become a part of its painful, hopeful resolution. He was no longer just a spectator. He was a participant in the long, quiet process of healing. The first, fragile breakthrough came with Sarah Jenkins. Eleanor had been reading a letter from her sister, a funny, witty letter filled with anecdotes and jokes. As Eleanor read it aloud, a small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Sarah's body. A few moments later, a single tear, a solitary pearl of emotion, rolled down her cheek. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The dam had been broken. The tears came slowly at first, a trickle of grief and sorrow for the lost years. Then came the laughter, the smiles, the small, joyful expressions of a soul slowly returning to its rightful home. The other women followed suit. One by one, the blank masks of their faces were replaced by the beautiful, messy chaos of human emotion. The process was not linear. There were days of regression, days of overwhelming sadness and confusion. But with the constant, unwavering support of their families and community, they found their way back. The process was a testament to the power of human love and resilience. Anne, Martha's daughter, was one of the last to heal. The trauma of her near drowning was a deep, psychological wound. She was haunted by nightmares, by the image of a cold, placid face holding her under the water. But with her mother's tireless love and the support of her community, she began to find her way. She started painting, her canvases a riot of color, a visual representation of the emotions she was learning to feel again. Her paintings were not just art, they were a testament to her recovery, a vibrant testament to the power of the human spirit to find beauty in the face of horror. In the end, Pastor Thorne was just a man who, in his own twisted way, was as empty as the women he had tried to make. He had spent his life trying to control and manipulate, to strip others of their emotions because he was incapable of feeling them himself. He had been a predator, but the true story of Havenwood was not about his darkness, but about the town's ability to overcome it. The final scene of the story is of Havenwood, a place no longer defined by silence and fear, but by life and laughter. The young women, once vacant vessels, were now vibrant, beautiful human beings, their faces a testament to the long, difficult journey back. The story of Havenwood was a story of hope, a testament to the power of love, connection, and the resilience of the human spirit. The monster was defeated, but the town had won a far greater victory. They had reclaimed their souls.